13 of Call of the Bully. So have you decided who is who on the cover yet? So in case you have not figured it out or weren't sure, this is Rodney. This is Todd. And over here is Magnus. Okay, so chapter 13 is Strikes and Balls. Hey, lay it on down, toe lappers. You got the chaws. Dig? No, we didn't dig. We were pretty far from digging. But Wu was our team's softball manager, so we nodded like we knew what he was talking about. Don't let no haze hang the cabeza. Go out there and lay it on nice and thick. You dig, Rodney? You're saying play hard? Hey now, make the bugs dance, young men with bats. He waited for us to go out onto the field. So armed with the strangest pep talk in history, we ran to our positions. Josh was on first, Thorin on second, Fernando on third. Stinky ran out to play catcher. But Gabe, the head of the boys division and today's umpire, began gagging and moved Stinky to center field. Mr. Cramps pitched, and I took my spot at shortstop. The rest of the cabin filled the outfield. Someone, who made me very nervous, however, had appointed himself pitcher for both teams. As if sensing my unease, Mr. Cramps turned toward me and called out, "I've been looking forward to this." He was smiling, but didn't look at all happy. I could feel the wickedness pouring out of him, and my stomach twisted as I pondered what he meant. A counselor named Gabe yelled, "Play ball!" Mr. Periwinkle stood on a hill near first base, surrounded by the whole camp. He looked like a kid on opening day. Unable to contain himself, he reached out and grabbed his wife's shoulder. His hand was abruptly swatted away as if it was a mosquito. Mrs. Periwinkle looked completely annoyed, kind of like she was inhaling the air next to Stinky. Her expression changed, and her cheeks darkened, however, when Fernando passed by, smiling in her direction. I kicked the dirt and tried to focus my thoughts. I had a lot of fun the other night. After the counselors took Josh and Fernando away, I said goodbye to Allison and the girls and made my way back to the cabin. When I finally got there, Josh couldn't stop talking about Rodnina. Fernando kept egging him on. Tell Rodney how pretty she was. I wanted to punch him, but the whole thing was so funny that I just went along with it. In fact, Fernando had been right when he said I would never forget the evening. It cemented the belief that I liked camp and wanted to stay. And now, knowing that I wanted to be here, my main goal was to win this game and beat Todd and Magnus. I looked at the 200 kids and counselors sitting around the camp's first couple. My stomach felt uneasy, and my palms began to sweat. If 400 eyes staring at us weren't enough, I couldn't help but notice one particularly devilish pair looking my way. They were accompanied by a slight, sly grin on full lips. I tried to shake it off, figuring she was probably giving similar looks to Todd. I pounded my fist into my mitt and looked up for the first time to inspect our opponents. I gulped. Who had invited the New York Yankees? All right, they weren't quite the Yankees, but seeing the Algonquins stretching, taking some practice swings, and wearing gleaming pinstriped uniforms, they sure looked the part. As Magnus brought them together for a pregame conference, I realized we weren't in their league. Not by a long shot. Without exception, they were big and athletic. Any swagger I possessed evaporated like a puddle in the Sahara. As the first inning got underway, I wasn't surprised to see things go downhill quickly. Mr. Cramps began the game with a slow, soft floater to an Algonquin named Biff. Biff's bat smacked a hard grounder right at Thorin Oakenshield. My jaw dropped as he caught it. Thorin pivoted and threw the ball to first. Josh stood looking blank and made no move to catch it. The ball bounced off the side of his skull with a hollow thud. Biff was safe. Josh's expression changed from dumb to dumb and angry. He started to charge Thorin. I blocked his way before our dwarf wizard second baseman was pounded into the dirt. Josh, You gotta catch the ball, then get the runner out, I said quickly. Catch. You get it? He looked from Thorin to me. Catch ball and get runner. Yes. See that kid with the bat? That's who you get. Josh nodded vaguely and walked back to first base. I turned to Thorin. Nice play. I'll have you know I'm an all-star seeker for my Quidditch team. Well, that's comforting news, I thought to myself. Another Algonquin, Chip, was waiting in the batting box. He was laughing with Todd and the other guys about Josh's play. They settled down, and Mr. Cramps again threw an excruciatingly slow toss that a kindergartner could have laced. Chip made contact and sent the ball bouncing toward my side of the infield. I felt the adrenaline pump through my veins as I dashed to the left. Reaching down, I was relieved to feel the ball collide with the inside of my mitt. I shifted my feet and made a perfect throw to first, all the while hoping that Tabitha was paying attention. Josh was ready this time and caught the ball. Then he yelled, "Get runner!" Next thing I knew, he ran right at Chip, yanked him off the ground, and body slammed him into foul territory. The result was pandemonium. Magnus went berserk, and after some discussion, the runner was declared out, which made Magnus even crazier. He looked like an insane Viking as he screamed at Gabe and tried to grab Josh. It was nice to see him so upset, but I have to admit he had a point. In the end, he calmed down after Gabe moved Josh out to left field. Play continued. Todd walked to the plate. He smiled and waved to the crowd. Most of them ignored him, but Mrs. Periwinkle clapped slightly. Funny how evil sticks together, I thought. Mr. Cramps flipped Todd a nice easy pitch. He didn't swing. A little lower, if you don't mind. Mr. Cramps nodded and tossed a ball that was slow and sweet and right in Todd's wheelhouse. He drilled it. I watched it fly out over the infield, right to center field, right at Stinky. I held my breath. Stinky looked up. Seeing the ball flying his way, he covered his head and flung himself to the ground as if the softball was a grenade. The ball missed him and rolled way out toward the woods. Todd was rounding third before anyone even picked it up. I stood there watching Tabitha and the Algonquins cheer their captain as he stepped on home, making it a 2-0 game. Somehow he started to play some defense and got the next 2 outs, but things didn't improve when it was our turn to bat. Thorin Oakenshield led off. I watched him pull out a wand and head to the batter's box. "You can't use that. It's too late," I said, stopping him. "Get a bat." "I'll have you know, Rodney, this wand is 11 inches. It's made from holly and has a phoenix feather inside. Nice and supple." He swished it over my head. My hair tingled as it passed. That was the end of the conversation, and he stepped into the box and laughs and taunts from the Algonquin. I turned to Fernando. "I thought you said he was smart." "I figured he was because he reads a lot." He shrugged. "Evidently, there's a difference." Mr. Cramps wound up his arm and threw a very quick, hard toss towards the plate. I cursed to myself as I realized it was nothing like the lazy lollipops he'd tossed the Algonquins. Thorin Oakenshield swung his wand, which shattered the second it made contact with the ball. "Ha ha! Very good!" Magnus's laugh boomed. Almost everyone else was laughing too. Thorin looked down at the splinters, then turned back to me. "I don't understand. They say the wand picks the wizard. It spoke to me." "What did it say? Stay away from baseball?" I led him aside. "Listen, why don't you have a conversation with one of those nice bats?" He stood there looking blank and dejected. I could hear Todd calling us idiots from the field. I looked at him in his fancy pinstripes, being nasty for no real reason, and my blood sizzled. I really wanted to beat the big jerk. That would show Todd. I grabbed Thorin's shoulder. I knew I had to speak his language. "Look at this one. It's aluminum. Probably has unicorn hair in it. No, I bet it has dragon scales." He grabbed me by the shirt. "Do you really think so?" Then his eyes narrowed. How do you know? Well, look at the writing. It's from Louisville. So, surely you've heard about the recent dragon sightings in Louisville. It's all over the internet. He didn't reply. He was looking at the bat, stroking it gently. I think it's speaking to me, he said, eyes beginning to glaze over. Sure it is. It's saying to go get a hit. He got into the box and actually ripped a line drive. It would have been a nice hit, but Cramps, looking like an Olympic gymnast, flew high into the air and made an amazing grab. He somersaulted and sprang cat-like to his feet. You're out, elf boy! Cramp's eyes blazed at us, at me in particular. It had already dawned on me that our pitcher wasn't going to give us a fair shake. But now, seeing that nasty grin of his, I knew he was out to make sure the Algonquins won. The rest of the inning was more of the same. Fast pitches and great plays by Cramps. Stinky struck out on 3 pitches. I batted third. Twice Cramps aimed for my head, and I had to dive to get out of the way. I glanced back at Fernando, who was lying near the bats along with his fans, Allison, Megan, and Danielle. I think he's trying to kill me, I called over to him. Perhaps, but look at the bright side. What bright side? I'm surrounded by beautiful women. Who could ask for anything more? My friend was no help, and the Algonquins were having a ball. Strike him out, Todd called from first base. I would have loved to silence them, but in the end I bounced a roller to second base. Biff tossed to Todd, and I was out. Things stayed pretty much the same for most of the game. We never scored and fell further behind. As we neared the bottom of the final inning, the score was 4-0. We were lucky to be that close. Most of the crowd was talking and goofing around, having lost interest in the pathetic, lopsided affair. The Algonquins took the field laughing, while we, the losers, were living up to our nickname. Almost immediately, we made 2 outs, and I sat dejectedly, waiting for the game to end. Someone else on the field was having a better time. Seeing that Josh was up, Todd laughed from first base. This should be good. What a perfect way to end this fiasco. While brilliant at pummeling wimps, Josh hadn't done much for anything yet in the batter's box, not counting the last time up when he threw his bat into center field, almost killing the second baseman. Some in the crowd, ready for one final bit of comic relief, focused on the at-bat. Moments later, a shocked gasp rang out as Josh topped the ball and hit a grounder toward third. But instead of running, he just stood there. Run to first, I yelled at him. Duh. Run that way, I pointed. Step on that white thing over there. Lumbering hard toward down the base path, he headed off toward Todd, who was waiting at the base for the throw from third. Todd's usual calm, arrogant expression changed to one of shaken fear as he saw Josh heading his way. I guess no one had actually explained to Josh you're supposed to drop the bat. Todd was so rattled by the club-swinging caveman heading his way that he forgot about the incoming ball, which sailed out to left field. Josh stopped on first, looking proud of his accomplishment. Run to second, I yelled. Before he could utter another duh, I added, over there! Step on that white thing! He took off again, and neither the shortstop nor the second baseman wanted anything to do with the bat-wielding madman. Go to third, I hollered. Over there! Josh kept running. Now run home! For a moment, Josh looked more puzzled than usual, but he kept running right off the field and into the crowd. It looked like he was heading toward the camp exit. Huh? Then it hit me. Not your home. Run to home plate. Step on this white thing. He wheeled back onto the field and darted toward home, with red eyes, huge muscles that swung the bat around his head, and a frothing mouth. He was a fearsome sight. I wasn't surprised when the catcher, who had received the ball from second, uttered a piercing screech and took off to cower behind Magnus. Josh, triumphant, stepped on the plate. You did it, Josh! A home run! We're on the board! He looked down at the plate, confused. I didn't bother to explain. Fernando, Stinky, and Thorin were all patting him on the back and cheering. The crowd loved it. Mr. Periwinkle called, Good show! Then I heard him utter to Mrs. Periwinkle, "I always knew there was something special about that one." A lot of our team's excitement died when Todd reminded us that we were still down by 3 runs. Then he added, "And that Abe can't bat for the rest of you." But our excitement, and more importantly our luck, didn't die completely. Fernando, much to the delight of his screeching personal cheerleaders and Mrs. Periwinkle, hit a grounder up the middle past a diving Mr. Cramps. Then Thorin Oakenshield, while screaming, "By the power of dragons!" laced a single to right field. Next up, Stinky somehow managed to make contact with the ball. The result was an improbable blooper over Todd's head. He scrambled for the ball, but when the dust settled, the now attentive crowd could see that Stinky was standing safe at first. I cheered loudly and high-fived Woo. "We're not out of it!" "No blues in that news," he replied. If the next batter got a hit, we could possibly win the game. I imagined the look of horror on Todd's face if we pulled it off. I smiled, pleased with the vision. As I pondered the possibilities, I looked off into the branches of a high oak tree behind first base. It was a nice moment, but then my chicken sense tingled, and I knew something was off. I glanced back around. The entire camp was staring at me. I looked down at myself. Was I having that dream again where I forgot to put my pants on? Seeing my shorts were where they were supposed to be, I was about to exhale in relief when certain realities smacked my brain. We were still losing by 3. There were 2 outs and the bases were loaded, and most importantly, I was up. Woo handed me a bat and said, "All right, Big Daddy, get a hit, and you're the cat's meow, the dog's bow wow, and the karate man's kapow." I nodded dumbly as my knees started to shake. Thorin Oakenshield must have noticed. He jogged over to me from second base and whispered, "Just close your eyes and let the force be your guide." Before anyone else could offer me weird advice, I started for the batter's box, very reluctantly. This wasn't the first reluctant walk of my life. I've had to approach haunted houses and the occasional biker den, and while this was only a summer softball game, it somehow felt just as awful. Fortunately, someone was waiting at home plate to give me some words of encouragement. Mr. Cramps leaned down, and his teeth flashed as he whispered, "Striking you out, with the whole camp watching, will be the highlight of my summer. I used to be the closer for the Toledo Mudhens. That's Triple-A ball. I can still hit over 90 miles an hour on the radar gun. Have fun." He smiled to the crowd and gave me a friendly, if rather hard, pat on the back. Many clapped for the display of sportsmanship. Previously in the game, Mr. Cramps pitched underhand, which of course is the traditional way to toss a softball. Now he stood like a big leaguer and threw at me overhand. I barely saw the ball. "Strike one!" yelled Gabe. Cramps winked at me as he caught the ball thrown back at the catcher. He wound up again. As the ball flew past, I swung. I felt nothing but air as the bat twirled around me. "Strike two!" I debated what to do. Run away? "Ready for the heat, Rathbone?" Mr. Cramps jeered. I noticed him give a slight nod at Mrs. Periwinkle and couldn't help but feel they were in this together. He took a few steps toward me from the mound and said in a low, sinister voice, "I sure am gonna enjoy this." He returned to the mound, and I watched his leg kick up. His arm went into its windup. I knew there was no way I'd be able to hit what was coming. Unless? As the ball left his fingers, I remembered Thorin's advice. I shut my eyes, put everything into it, and swung for the fences. I could hear the bat slice through the air and was fully expecting it to keep going. Only something hard stopped it. I don't know whether it was the force or dumb luck, but the bat had actually collided with the ball. I could both feel and hear that perfect crack. I opened my eyes. Instead of sailing out past the outfielder's head as I had hoped, the ball shot like a laser right at the unsuspecting Mr. Cramps, hammering him in the belly. Actually, several inches below the belly. He let out a wail and crumpled to the ground. For a moment I stood in shock. Then my mind caught on and I raced down the first baseline. Fernando, Thorn, Oakenshield, and Stinky were rounding second and third and on their way home. I flew past second. Mr. Cramps was still rolling back and forth, screeching. Todd tried to grab the ball but was having a difficult time getting around the writhing gym teacher. I sailed past third and headed for home. Todd finally scooped up the ball and tossed it to the catcher. A second after my sneaker stomped down on home plate. We won 5-4. I was met by the fellas and hoisted onto their shoulders. The camp was rocking. People were laughing and pointing. I noticed Magnus beating his fists into the ground like a spoiled 2-year-old. Todd was speeding away on his Segway. Mr. Periwinkle was hugging Mrs. Periwinkle, who was doing her best to pry him off. Tabitha was looking my way, smiling. I didn't know how to react to that one. It was then that I noticed Mr. Cramps. He was still on the pitcher's mound, bent over and resting on one knee. Having been carried around on shoulders before, I cut the celebration short and decided to have some real fun. I slid into the crowd and approached the insane athletics teacher. His face looked like a beet, and his eyes were wet and angry. I bent over slightly and asked, So what? He growled through clenched teeth. So, did you enjoy the game? Chapter 14. News from home. Make way for Orcrist, shouted Thorin. Orcrist, the goblin cleaver. He was leading the way home after the ball game, the aluminum bat held out in front of him as if it were a sword. Orcrist shall be placed on my chest when I'm buried under the mountain. Sure, I laughed. Whatever you want, you and Oatmeal earned. Orcrist, he corrected me. Yeah, you and old Orcrist taught the Algonquins a lesson today. We all did. We were straggling along in back of Thorin, the most unlikely of victorious teams. It wasn't exactly a ticker-tape parade down Broadway, but it felt that way to us. The walk back to the cabin was filled with high fives and laughs. The camp was electric. Everyone was thrilled with the Algonquins' defeat. It sure was nice, the so-called losers being congratulated, but some of my cabin mates were having trouble with all the attention. Stinky, for instance, panicked as the crowd swarmed around him. He ran behind Woo, who told him, Relax, Frankie boy. No worries for the sun in the sun. I shook my head slightly, thinking Stinky needed some help, but then I noticed someone who needed it a whole lot more. My eyes popped out as I saw Josh about to punch a fan. What are you doing? I yelled. I ran over and grabbed Josh, saving some little blonde kid from one heck of a blow. They whacked me on the back. I whacked them in the face. No, Josh. A pat on the back is a way of saying, good job or whatever. It is? I could see him thinking. His face scrunched up and his big forehead was creased with lines. Fernando noticed too and whispered to me, Our friends may be a bit odd, but they never cease to make life interesting. I thought about that later on in Loserville and smiled. Yes, my new friends sure knew how to keep things interesting. I climbed into bed and let my mind play over the events of the day. Most of it was pretty funny, but then I thought about Tabitha. I tossed and turned a while. It's very confusing when you like someone you also dislike. I rolled over and missed Jessica more than ever. Now there was a girl who was also pretty, but also nice. Of course. Allison was nice too. Eventually the sounds of night and the breathing of my cabin mate soothed my restlessness. Before I closed my eyes, the last thing I saw was Thorin, aluminum bat lying proudly by his side. Thanks to Fernando, Tabitha was still on my mind the following morning. Eating breakfast in the dining hall, he said, That was a lot of fun yesterday. I think Tabitha liked the game too. I have no idea if she did or didn't, and I don't care, I lied. Fernando shifted his eyes, signaling for me to look left. There she was, across the room, staring at me with her big green eyes. The runny eggs turned in my stomach. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. She was so pretty it hurt. Don't fight it, Rodney. The feisty ones are the most fun. Fernando was obviously enjoying himself. Then more seriously, he said, admit it. You know you don't want to leave this place. Still caught in the trance of her gaze, I nodded dumbly. Eventually, my attention shifted back to Fernando, and for the first time I told him what I already knew myself. You're right. I don't want to leave camp. Before I had a chance to say any more, Gabe yelled, Mail for Rathbone! And dropped 2 envelopes on my plate. Let's see, I have another. This one's for Fernando. A fancy pink envelope seemed to float down to the table. Even from where I sat, I could smell the perfume coming off it. Your letter smells nice, Stinky said. For someone who stunk like a dead fish, he sure seemed to appreciate a good scent. Chanel number 5, Fernando replied, holding it to his nose. I let the conversation fade and turned my attention to the 2 envelopes sitting in front of me. I eyed the first. With a sense of dread, I saw it from my parents. Would it say they were on their way to pick me up? Was this my last meal at Camp Waimea? I lifted up the other letter. It was from Jessica. My heart skipped a couple of beats. There's something about a handwritten letter. It's different than a text message. It was from Jessica? My heart skipped a couple of beats. There's something about a handwritten letter. It's different than a text message, and I was excited to hold it. Did Jessica miss me? If she did and I was being pulled out of here, leaving might not be so bad. All of the questions and thoughts quickened my pulse, and I felt short of breath. I exhaled and looked up at the ceiling. As my gaze made its way back down, Fernando asked, Your parents? I nodded. And Jessica? I nodded again. Open them, he said. I figured I'd read Jessica's letter when I was alone. I stuck my finger into the corner of my parents' letter and ripped it open. I pulled out the folded stationery and noticed my mom's loopy handwriting. I gulped and began to read. Dear Rodney, we were happy to receive your letter. We were even happier to read about how much you love Camp Waimea. Huh? I thought. We're so pleased to hear that you've made so many friends and that there are such nice counselors. It really seems like the people you mentioned, such as Mrs. Periwinkle and Magnus, have taken a special interest in you. Was my mom losing it? I clearly said I hated them. Knowing that there are kind, thoughtful people like them keeping an eye on you makes me so relieved. I was very nervous about sending my baby away. It's also so nice you've made a special friend in Todd. Todd? What's going on? I never said that. Anyway, your friend Toby has been asking about you. He said he and his older brother would be keeping an eye on you next fall in middle school. Isn't that thoughtful of him? Ugh! Well, I better go chase your father away from the little treat I've cooked up for you. We love you very much. Love, Mom and Dad. P.S. I've been taking cooking classes, and the treat I mentioned was a batch of chocolate chip cookies that I hope to bring up to you. But since you're having so much fun, we've decided to go on vacation with the Windbaggers to their house on Lake Snore. We don't want to interrupt your fun. Okay. I would have mailed the cookies, but your dad ate them. Sorry. Anyway, I'm sure camp food is delicious. My jaw hung open as I reread and then reread again the words my mother had written. How in the world did she come up with that load of nonsense? My letter clearly described how much I hated camp, and especially hated Mrs. Periwinkle, Todd, and Magnus. I didn't fully believe my senses. I looked around the dining hall. Magnus was singing some bizarre song and pounding his fist on the table. Mr. Cramps was adjusting a bag of ice on his lap. Seeing me glance at him, he grabbed a piece of toast and took a savage bite. Mr. Periwinkle sat looking down at all of us with his usual beaming smile. Next to him sat Mrs. Periwinkle, who I noticed with alarm was glaring right at me. What was going on? The bizarre screwy letter from my mom messed with my brain. As I unfolded the page, I caught a momentary whiff of her shampoo. It may not have been Chanel number 5, but it sent a shiver down my spine. What I read almost sent my eggs back up into my throat. Dear Rodney, I was very upset by your letter. I thought you really liked me. I can't believe you're breaking up with me. I almost cried when I read it. But Toby reminded me that there are lots of other boys around. So, have fun at your camp and have a nice life. Jess. It was the hammer blow. The page fell from my hand and my face landed with a thud on my plate. Wow, Rodney, you must be really hungry, Josh said. Let me try eating like that. I heard what sounded like a pig eating from a trough, followed by, Shakily, I lifted my head from my plate. Some egg fell from my cheek and landed in my lap. I was too upset to care. Let Fernando see, said Fernando. He picked up my letters and read both. When he was finished, he set them down and looked at me. Well, I asked. You're screwed. What? I blurted. Someone is intercepting your mail. Devious move, too. Let's think about this. Do you have any enemies? The whole table cracked up laughing. Yes, silly question. Rodney here seems rather gifted at getting people to dislike him. Let's make a list. Mrs. Periwinkle hates him, Stinky said. Yes, that's a good one, Fernando replied. Magnus can't stand him, Thorin added. Yes, that's true, Fernando nodded. Todd and Chip and Biff and Skip and, yes, very good, all the Algonquins hate him. I get it, who else? Stinky thought and said, Mr. Cramps was trying to kill him with the softball. Excellent point, Frank. Don't forget Mrs. Periwinkle's horse Lucifer, Thorin added excitedly. Very good, although I think we can cross him off the letter plot. Okay, I'm sure Rodney here has at least a dozen more enemies we don't know about. Hey, I interrupted. They all looked at me. My girlfriend just broke up with me. Listening to how many people hate me isn't helping. Well, we like you, right, boys? Yeah, they all replied in unison. Fernando went on. We'll do whatever it takes to solve this mystery, right, boys? Yeah, they said in unison. Even if it puts us at great personal risk, right, boys? The usually loud table went silent. Everyone seemed to be studying their forks and spoons with great interest. Fernando leaned across the table. I'll run any risk. And I've already identified our first opportunity to investigate. What opportunity? I asked. Feast your eyes on this. He handed me his perfumed letter. Dear Fernando, you're invited to my home to discuss your punishment over lunch Friday at 12 p.m. I hope lobster is fine with you. I look forward to seeing you then. All the best, Agatha Periwinkle. Sounds like you're in for a rough time, I observed. I scrape mussels and you eat lobster. Fernando smiled. We all have our roles in life. But don't you see, this is just the chance we need. How's that? I asked. The rest of the table moved in closer to hear him. I'm invited to Mrs. Periwinkle's house. She's the most likely culprit. Even if those other people hate you, they probably don't have access to outgoing mail. That's true, Stinky added excitedly. Good thinking. Everyone at the table, including me, was beginning to like Fernando's plan. That is, except Fernando. A look of disappointment came on his face. What's wrong? I asked. I just realized that I have no idea what I would search for. What I would search for. She's probably destroyed your original letters by now. Almost in unison, my cabin mates and I sat back dejectedly. Not necessarily, Thorin shouted. We sprang forward again and leaned in closer to hear what he had to say. After all, the kid was pretty smart. Thorin rose up and his eyes glazed over. Think of Muad'Dib's poor father done in by a traitor. The whole table sat back slowly. Sure, smart, yes, but nuts. No, he continued, don't you see? Spies. And in this case, our spy would need samples of your handwriting when Baron Vladimir Harkonnen infiltrated House Atreides with the Sook Dr. Wellington Yuh. Fernando coughed and interrupted. All right, enough gibberish for a moment. I'm trying to focus. Wait, he's making sense, I said. You're scaring me, Rathbone. You mean you understand all this Baron Wooka stuff? Not that, the letters. If she's forging my handwriting to fool my parents and Jessica, she's probably held on to my letters to keep copying my handwriting. Brilliant, Thorin. Thorin took an elaborate bow. Of course, it won't be easy for you to go snooping around. True, a lady's attention rarely strays from Fernando. We'll need another way in, and sadly, campers are rarely invited into the Periwinkle house. However, Allison did mention that she was invited next week to something they have every year called the Girls' Cotillion Dinner. So was Tabitha, I added. She told me like it was like some big deal. The most popular girls get invited. Fernando continued. Allison said there'd be 10 or 11 girls going. The perfect number for someone to slip away and snoop and not get caught. Too bad none of us are girls, though. Hello, boys, a silky voice interrupted us. I spun around. Allison's red hair blew in my direction. Her hand held a fancy pink envelope similar to Fernando's. She looked at me teasingly, and I noticed her eyes sparkle. I think this belongs to you. She smiled, handing me the envelope. A little confused, I looked at it and removed my letter. Read it out loud, Thorin pleaded. I cleared my throat and began. Dear Rodwina, it was truly a pleasure meeting you the other night. I think you are just the kind of young lady to invite to the annual Girls' Cotillion dinner next Friday evening at 7 p.m. I look forward to seeing you there. Sincerely, Mrs. Periwinkle. Excellent, that's it, Fernando said with a beaming smile. Problem solved. As the meaning of his words came clear to me, my face fell forward into my plate for the second time that morning. Fernando patted me on the shoulder. Come, my friend. It is time to leave. And think on the bright side. What's that? I muttered into my eggs. At least you're one of the popular girls. And that is the end of the chapter.